Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I can't think of anyone who has had more experience negotiating with the police and successfully defending protesters than Norman Siegel. He's one of the country's finest attorneys defending civil rights and civil liberties, and he's my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you for the nice intro.
So what can we do? Can we ever have peace between our law enforcement and our public?
Oh, sure. I think that we will come out of this negative period stronger. I think we need to do certain things. To begin with, we need to renew respect and trust from the police towards the community, especially the communities of color and poor people. And communities need to respect the police as well. There is common ground here. We've had a lack of leadership politically and even in the community, but I do think that there's a way out of this mess.
It's on so many different levels. I think correct. When you begin to think about it, there's so many different things. The New York City part is just a part of it, right?
That is correct, but New York City mirrors, and there's a ripple effect of what happens here in other locales throughout America. This is not a New York City unique problem, it's an American problem. And
we started this with, what did you call it? Stop and search?
Stop and frisk.
It was the catalyst, wasn't it, to the most recent unrest?
As long as we qualify by saying the most recent.
Yeah, right.
Right, but even there, and sometimes I had to be critical to the very groups that I represented, because stop and frisk is a legitimate law enforcement weapon. The problem here was that it was being abused. The Supreme Court in the seminal case Terry versus Ohio for 1969 set forth what the standard was, and what was happening in New York, especially during the Bloomberg years, was that the police were not following the dictates of the Supreme Court decision, and that's what created the real problem, and there was a disproportionate impact on young men of color.
I always wondered, because I did think that there was legitimacy to it, to some degree. So, I mean, we find ourselves, if we object to stop and frisk and now to the broken windows concept, it's almost like police techniques to reduce crime are antithetical to civil liberties, and they shouldn't be. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, but they're not. I mean, there's enough common ground here where overwhelmingly the members of the New York Police Department are good cops. But there's some myths out there. Myth number one, it's a few bad apples. I hear commentators, elected officials saying it's a handful. Handful means like 5 people out of 40,000? No way. We should talk the truth. And the truth sometimes is harmful, it's painful, and elected officials, except for people when you were there, they don't want to deal with the truth. But I think one of the problems that we have right now is that people don't talk the truth, and as a result, people out on the street, and even people in rank and file in the police department, recognize that they're being given statements that are not truthful, that are politically expedient, both from the NYPD as well as some of the leadership in the civil rights groups, and as a result, they don't trust leadership. And if we go down that road, that's even more dangerous than the schism between the police and the community.
We need to have police.
We definitely
need to have, is that what you call the rule of law?
It's the rule
They're
of law.
enforcers of the...
But it's more than that. I know so many police officers, including some that I've represented, that are really good people.
Oh, absolutely.
When you talk about Officer Ramos and Lou, they are wonderful people from what we've been told. And so the stereotypes on both ends. I can remember twice in my career police saying that I got to go to the effing zoo to deal with the animals. On the other hand, I remember numerous times people who were demonstrating saying, oh, here come the pigs. It's interesting, the reference to animal terms on both sides. So there needs to be an enormous amount of re-education and undoing the stereotypes, especially at the police academy and in the precincts. And to give Commissioner Bratton some praise, in his statements at the 2 funerals, in the first one with Officer Ramos, he actually said we need to see each other. And I interpreted that to mean we have to understand that the stereotypes are blocking us from really beginning to find the common ground. But I'm convinced there is common ground.
I think part of it starts with a screening of applicants, don't you think? I mean,
Absolutely.
you can tell by talking and interviewing people, can't you, some of their underlying feelings about people and
Well,
race?
I think we all have biases, and especially young men who come into the police department who grew up in the suburbs.
Men and women.
But the women are generally better,
Better.
as a general rule, on these issues than men. When I've been out on the streets, and if I'm dealing with a woman officer, I usually get more receptivity and less hostility than the men as a general rule. I don't want to stereotype all women and all men, but I consciously left out the women in that because I think the problem becomes from a machismo. It's a culture, and the bias in machismo leads to racism, to sexism, to homophobia, and the material that the police use is not effective, in my opinion. When Giuliani put me on a task force after the Weimer situation, when I looked at the material that they were using to train people at the academy, it reinforced the stereotypes. Now, maybe they've changed some of it, but I'm not confident of that. And that's the kind of massive retraining that is necessary from the police department's point of view. And second, from the community's point of view, you can't lump all the cops. It's not monolithic, but it's not just a handful. We're talking about, in my opinion, of somewhere probably 700 or 800, 1 or 2% of the 40,000 that are problematic. And in addition to the initial screening, what I found out is that there's no further psychological testing. So a cop comes in, they're 21, 22, young, innocent, not experienced. After 10 years of dealing with probably the worst elements of our society, they become so stressed out that they're walking time bombs. And there should be, with due process of course, a random psych testing periodically. So it's not just screening people out in the beginning, but later on. And let's assume you find someone who's a walking time bomb. You don't discipline them, you don't fire them, you give them social services. And you try to recognize that what's happening to that individual is also affecting his wife, his children, and you look at it in a humanistic way. And I think if you did that, some of the rank and file and the union leaders would be more appreciative of the political leaders that are moving in that direction. When you don't have that kind of outlook, no wonder they turn their back on the mayor.
I was thinking while you said that, teachers get sabbaticals. And
that's an interesting idea. I would not be opposed to it because I do think that from my experience, I think of myself, if I was out there for 5 or 10 years dealing with the evil that's out there, and I use that word consciously, it would have to negatively affect my head, my body, my heart. And I think that you need to, every once in a while, give some support, social service support, to the people who are out there, because they're human beings as well. And part of the problem here is those reference that I made before to the police saying certain things and the community people, is we don't see each other as human beings. And when you don't see each other as human beings, the stereotypes get etched in stone.
But I mean, the stereotypes are we talking about protesters now, basically?
I think that there are protesters. They're not monolithic either.
Right.
I think that the mayor blew the opportunity when there was violence on the bridge not to come down immediately. All of a sudden we're using the word alleged. That backfires. I think that, people should go see the film Selmer and see how the leadership used to deal with nonviolence versus violence back in the 60s. And that doesn't occur here. I think that when people are protesting and doing it consistent with the principles and values of the First Amendment, quintessential peaceful protest, 100% for that. When you step over that line and you start, as we saw in Ferguson, people firebombing, people destroying property, I think you have to be very clear and say in very unequivocal terms, that is not accepted. Those people should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And when people are throwing things at police officers, they should be prosecuted as well.
Well, they're provoked also, the police officers, just by language. It doesn't even mean throwing.
Well, but language, they should be trained to accept that.
To take it.
There's a difference between speech and conduct.
To expect it, yeah.
Yeah, speech is protected, conduct is not. And I always am troubled over the fact that those points are elemental to me. And then when they get muddied, I get nervous because then there's no clarity of where the line is of what's okay and what's not okay.
I always see a picture of you always standing there with some pad or papers all ready to go to work, a little by yourself, right?
Well, very often that, and now we have this valuable
right.
element.
So that makes a big difference.
Well, it's important for the police and sometimes the protesters as well to know that somebody is closely monitoring what's going on and that there's a record and that people will be held accountable. And I have found, especially with the police, when they see you there, they don't do certain things because they don't want to be held accountable if they're doing something improper. So I think having legal observers at demonstrations is very important.
But do you feel that your protesters feel the same restriction? Do they ever make you upset you?
No, of course. Clients very often upset the lawyer. But I think, again, it's a mistake in the last month. There's been a lot of errors here, and one of the errors is to think of the protesters as a monolithic group. There are so many subcategories of the protesters. I also thought it was a mistake for elected officials to tell the protesters, don't protest. The groups I've working with, they on their own had enough sense not to protest until the funerals were over. I've had a couple of projects that I'm working on where we suspended it until after the funerals. So when the authority figure tells the protesters, especially the young protesters, don't do X, it only encourages them to do X. And so you have to understand the psychology behind all of this in order to effectively govern. And unfortunately, in my opinion, some of the present officials don't really know how to govern.
Did you think that it was not wise for the elected members to have their own die-in in front of City Hall?
Yes. I think that that was pandering, and I think that people don't understand the role. I'll give you an example. When I went to Mississippi in 1966, this great woman, Anita Blackwell, one of the classic women organizers in Mississippi. My first weekend there was going to be a march. I was really revved up. I'm ready to march. And Miss Blackwell said to me, now, boy, she could call me boy. She said, boy, we don't need your body with us now. We need your body to get our bodies out when we're in jail. And it made me understand that I had a separation, and also that I was there as a technician. And I followed that for a long way. I have some arguments with young lawyers now who want to commit civil disobedience. I don't approve of that for lawyers. Our role is to uphold the law. If the law is not making sense, figure out a way to challenge it in the law or go to the legislature and change it. So the roles get confusing at times, and I think that adds to the muddiness and the confusing state that we're in right now.
I think that's happening in this administration. I hate to say that, but I mean, I always thought when you're an elected official, you welcome the outside pressure. You welcome those demonstrations and all the pressure they bring, but you welcome them so it helps you inside move what they want in a way.
The best example is on the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights of '65. You needed Martin King and Lyndon Johnson in order to bring about the effective change. And there's now controversy of the roles of Lyndon Johnson, but my position is that both were necessary for historical change.
Yeah, so it is an important thing.
It is absolutely.
So where did we go wrong here?
Well, I think
it's so political in a way, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think that's true. I think to some extent the mayor didn't understand that they became his police. He should have gone to every precinct in the first few months of his administration, understanding what he campaigned on and how that could alienate especially the union leadership. What you needed to do is then figure out a way to distill that kind of animosity and to minimize the potential for what we now have. And not doing that was a big mistake to begin with. I remember Bill Lynch when we tried to do the Civilian Complaint
Yeah,
Review Board,
yeah.
and for your viewers, Ronnie was one of the 3 main sponsors on that. And I remember talking to him, and he was talking about that they were his police, meaning that Dinkins now was their police. And I always said to him, I'm not sure they're ever going to be your police, but I understand you have to work with them, but we have to push this. You ran on this, we'll carry the advocacy, and then you make it happen. So I think there has to be the inside-outside dynamic, and right now, for a lot of the people that I work with, they say when they write to the mayor's administration, they don't get any response back. I know that's happened to me on numerous occasions where you reach out trying to build some bridges or try to suggest certain ways that we can move so that we don't have these tensions, and when you don't get a response, that speaks volumes.
I have to, this is a personal thing, but since I left the government, I find the idea of contacting somebody there so daunting that I don't even try anymore. And why? That should never be that way, you know?
Well, it's that, and also good government officials would be creating the opportunities for people to very easily be able to communicate.
Yeah, yeah.
That doesn't happen. I'm working on some projects in the next week which will be announced, which will try to build some bridges between the law enforcement community and the protest community. I think that's needed. I think it can happen. And New York has a rich history of people agreeing to disagree, but then agreeing on, even if it's 3 things to agree on, so that you're all working together. And then when you work together around the table, you realize that, oh my God, I didn't realize that you were a real person. It does work.
It does. You really believe that. Is that like the flash dating and stuff like that? Forget it, I'm not even going to start there. But I think the point that you made is very good, that it is his police force. I mean, it's a police force, and he has to deal with it. And especially coming out of that election, I guess the first thing that started was the meeting with the police commissioner in Sharpton.
No, even before that, it was
that.
the speeches at the inauguration.
Oh, that was
They were
terrible.
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 And someone should have then stood up and said, I disassociate myself from some of the rhetoric that's being made here. You know, I love some of the people, including Harry Belafonte. You know, he's one of my heroes, but some of that language was uncalled for on that day. So that was the beginning. And I think that people have to recognize that when you say certain things, there are consequences.
It's the whole framework. I mean, you're right.
But there's systemic
no
change that has to happen.
Yeah.
There has to be a review of the grand jury process. Ferguson, Staten Island, the confusion and then turning into resentment is because it's a secret process.
Yeah.
And although people are trying to get the minutes and redact the names, it's very likely that that won't be granted. So we have to then turn to the state to amend those laws, or perhaps, as many states are doing more and more now, are creating an alternative to the grand jury, which is a public preliminary hearing that is seen publicly. It's an adversarial proceeding before a judge to determine whether there's probable cause. Because if you put the 23 people in a room and it's secret and they don't come out with an indictment, even if there's grounds not to have an indictment, people don't trust that process. Legitimately don't trust it.
You're talking generally.
Yes.
Generally, not special process.
Right, but then second, I do think we need to recognize the conflict of interest between the local prosecutors in the 61 counties in the state, who on a day-to-day basis rely on who? The police to prosecute their cases. So you have to create, as we once did before, interesting with Mario Cuomo, who actually was Rockefeller, and then Mario Cuomo undid the special prosecutor for only corruption. We now need a special prosecutor statewide, independent special prosecutor for corruption and brutality, because corruption and brutality go hand in hand. And if we can do that, then you'll start to see perhaps more trust in the criminal justice system. And I'm making this argument not in a result-oriented fashion, but I'm making the argument in a process, that if the process is not open and perceived to be fair, you're going to have confusion and resentment, which we saw in Ferguson, and we now see in New York as a result of Staten Island. You watch the videotape of what happens to Eric Gardner, and then you don't get a probable cause. 2/3 of the people in New York legitimately, in my mind, say, we don't understand it. and then there's no explanation. There could be an explanation, but when it's not being publicly made, what do you expect other than confusion and resentment?
Do you think the question of race has been exacerbated starting with the election of an African-American president?
I think that there has been and continues to be enormous racial overtones to all of these discussions. I think that I will get myself a little trouble here by saying that I even think the anger at de Blasio because of his wife's role has racial and gender overtones. I think that I don't understand the resentment to Charlene. I've met her a couple of times. She's intelligent, she's thoughtful, and if she was white, would there be the same kind of hostility towards her by people in the city? I still see interracial couples walking hand in hand in my neighborhood on the Upper West Side and seeing people even look at them.
Do you really? I see so many interracial.
But I still think there's an element of that. And Loving versus Virginia happened many years ago, but there's still some of that residue. And so I think that from my perspective, you can't underestimate the racial aspects to all of these issues. They're complicated to begin with, but when they have racial overtones, they become more difficult. And why? Because we still, up south, don't deal with race honestly. When I look at my experience in the South in the 60s and early 70s, in retrospect, at least people were candid about their prejudices. Up here, it's more sophisticated and more subtle, but it still ain't what it's supposed to be.
I think that it's very basic in Washington.
I agree. I think so much of the hostility and opposition to the president is because he is African American.
Absolutely. And so that's one of the things, I mean, I agree with you. The race, it was not a sign that racism has disappeared by electing.
No, it hasn't disappeared, but again, the same problem. We don't talk about it. We don't have town hall meetings about these issues. And even the president, who's been disappointing in some ways, in my opinion, wasn't bold enough until maybe the last month or two now, when perhaps there are no political repercussions. But I've always respected people who are strong, because when you're coming from strength, whether people agree or disagree with you, they'll respect your commitment to certain principle. And when you don't have that principle in bold neon, I think people think that you're soft, they can take advantage of you, and therefore I think that that's part of the problem on the national level.
Let's switch a little bit. If I were asked to say something about my favorite photographs of the year, one of them was you sitting outside the tent in New Jersey with the nurse.
Yeah, that was an important case to try to stop the hysteria.
Was that not unbelievable?
It was, but you know...
You don't get surprised by things, do you?
Well, no, because when she called, I went in, I worked very often on Saturday
We're talking
afternoons.
about now the nurse
Casey Hickox,
who came
right, from Sierra Leone, and then was, by Christie, put in a tent, quarantined, even though she didn't have any symptoms. When the call came on a Saturday afternoon, so lawyers work on Saturday afternoons, because if I wasn't there, I never would have got that case. So what happens is that in a case like that, people said, well, you move so quickly. Why? Because in '85, when I became the head of the Civil Liberties Union, the same hysteria was about HIV/AIDS.
Yes, right.
And so I was able to draw upon that historical experience where I wasn't so sure back then what the thing to do was, but there was talk about quarantining people from the LGBT community back then, and we resisted that, and history proved us to be correct. So this time, I had no hesitation in immediately getting out of the gate and saying, there's a due process violation here, or liberty interest is violated, and it's not over yet because here's an exclusive for you, we just recently filed a notice of claim to go against New Jersey for violating her rights. Why? Because she's going to go back to Sierra Leone, and when she comes back in February or March, she's going to face the same policy. So we have to declare that policy unconstitutional. And finally, she was an ideal client. She was incredibly bright, she was charismatic, telegenic, And there were times, I remember we were on Meet the Press, and they asked her a question, and I said, oh my God, where's she going on that? And then I realized she answered the question even better than I could have answered the question. So when you have clients like that, it's ideal.
It's a joy.
It's a joy.
So, but again, that was leadership, political leadership.
Yeah, both Cuomo and Christie pandered, and they helped create an unwarranted crisis that really should have been dealt with differently. And so it does go back to leadership. When people talk about it doesn't really matter who gets elected, I vastly disagree. I think when you have people, I remember I always told you when you were at the city council, it was good to have someone who could speak and write in clear, definitive terms, and it was a pleasure always having to be an advocate with you.
Well, it was always a pleasure to work with you. But a lot of it comes down to common sense.
Yes, but also as I get older, I think it's
depth of
principles.
understanding.
Well, but principles.
Principles,
You know,
that's
like
the
things
basic
like
thing.
First Amendment, you know, that it's easy to support someone's right to speak when you agree with their content. The real question is, do you support them when you don't agree with them? And too often people fail that test. And I think that when you're got some principles, or second, neutral principles, that it applies. You know, for example, people recently are saying the cops shouldn't turn their back. They have a First Amendment right to do that. Should they do it? That's not for me to judge. But when people start talking about that, you know, they should be punished for that, I mean, they have the same First Amendment right, and it's the quintessential peaceful. How many college graduations during the Vietnam period when students would turn their back on the speaker? We were supporting that because why? We supported that principle about getting out of Vietnam, which was the correct position then. But when the cops are doing that, whether you agree or disagree, you shouldn't be condemning them for turning their back. They're not in the funeral parlor. They're out on the street. I just sometimes...
And they're not on duty either.
Yeah, except
Well, they
they're
are, I
wearing the
guess.
uniform.
Yeah.
But, you know, when it was the Civil Liberties Union, they wanted to wear the American flag. And we defended them on that one. It was easy, but I would have defended them if they were wearing the black nationalist flag. The point is that if people are expressing their viewpoint, I want them to express their viewpoint. There's too much of the censorship and the repression of free speech. We need more free speech.
Well, we've come to the end of this program,
Oh, that's
but
great.
I am glad to observe that you are still optimistic.
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Thank you, Norman Siegel.
Thank you, Ronnie Eldridge.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.